What if I told you there's a village so quiet, so peaceful, and so untouched by time that nothing of any significance happened there for an entire century? No scandals, no wars, no heroes, no disasters, just chickens, tea, weather, and the slow ticking of time. Sound boring? Maybe, but for those who lived there, it was everything. And by the end of this story, you just might wish you could live there too. Tucked between two forgotten hills and a brook that babbled only when it felt like it, there was a village so small that most maps didn't bother to include it. Some called it Hempsford, others just called it the quiet place past the oaks. No one really knew when it was founded. Some said it had always been there, others joked it simply appeared one foggy morning, and no one bothered to question it. No one came looking for Hempsford, and the villagers never thought to leave. The footpath that led there was barely a trail, just a suggestion, really, winding through trees that leaned together like they were whispering secrets. At its entrance, an old mossy sign read, "Do not disturb." Not a warning, just a suggestion. In Hempsford, the idea of doing nothing wasn't laziness, it was an art. Days unfolded slowly, gently, like pages in a forgotten book. The sun rose without fanfare and set with a sigh. People didn't live for tomorrow or dwell on yesterday. They lived in the slow hum of now. The village clock tower hadn't worked in decades, but no one noticed. They told time by the bread at Mr. Tallow's bakery. The smell of sourdough meant morning, and the warm, nutty rye meant it was almost time for the evening fire. Mr. Tallow was the village baker, a wiry man with soft eyes and thick hands dusted in flour that seemed permanent. He opened his shop each morning at 6, though no one came until 8. That suited him fine. He liked the ritual. Every loaf was shaped with care, and the dough rested exactly as long as it needed to. There was no rushing bread, just as there was no rushing time. His scones were legendary, though no one outside the village would ever know it. He served only 3 types of bread, 1 kind of scone, and a single pot of tea that brewed from Monday to Sunday. He said it got stronger with patience. Life in Hempsford moved to rhythms older than calendars. Seasons dictated the tasks. Spring was for planting, summer was for waiting, autumn was for harvesting, and winter was for stories. Every winter evening, after dusk, the villagers would gather in whichever house had the warmest fire. They'd sit with knitting or shell peas or simply each other's company, and old Miss Pebble would tell stories. Nothing extraordinary, no dragons, no battles, no quests, just stories of misplaced boots, stubborn chickens, and a mysterious pie that no one remembered baking. The stories didn't matter for their content, but for their company. Listening was an act of care. Children in the village didn't go to school. There wasn't one. They learned what they needed from their grandparents. How to find eggs without upsetting hens, how to patch a leaky roof with moss and stubbornness, how to read the clouds and tell when a storm might be thinking about arriving. They learned to sit still, to listen longer than they spoke, and to treasure silence like a favorite sweater. Every year, Hempsford held the Festival of the Nothing. There were no banners, no performers, no fuss. They met in the village square, sat on wooden stools, and toasted the fact that once again nothing had happened. No fires, no floods, no misplaced sheep. It was a celebration of the ordinary. Children chalked pictures on the cobblestones. Someone played a slow tune on a fiddle. The rest just sat, sipping warm cider, watching the sun slide down the sky like honey from a spoon. Of course, occasionally something happened, barely. One winter, a crow got stuck in Mrs. Laverly's chimney. 3 villagers came running. Mr. Tallow brought his bread peel to poke it out. The blacksmith brought a glove. The crow flew away before anyone did anything. Still, it became the talk of the village for weeks. There was a debate about renaming the bakery the Crow's Crust, but Mr. Tallow thought it sounded too showy. Another time, a traveling painter arrived looking for inspiration. He painted the same tree 5 times, then left muttering about the creative void. The villagers just smiled and waved him off. They knew art wasn't about spectacle, it was about presence. Sometimes strangers passed through Hempsford. They were always polite, always surprised. One boy from a distant city stayed for a week. He arrived loud and fast, tapping at a phone that didn't work, asking where the Wi-Fi was. By the end of the week, he had slowed. He helped Mr. Tallow knead dough, learned to knit a lumpy scarf, and spent long hours watching the brook. On his last day, he said, "This place is like a yawn, but in a good way." No one in Hempsford held titles. There was no mayor, no council. Decisions were made with long silences and thoughtful nods. often over tea. If something broke, someone fixed it. If someone fell ill, they were cared for. If a new baby was born, the village knit booties in one long, meandering circle that passed from house to house. Old traditions held steady. Every house kept a kettle warm and doors were rarely locked, not because crime didn't exist, but because no one remembered where the keys were. The postman came when he felt like it, sometimes weekly, sometimes not. If a letter was important, it would find its way. Even the burial ground was quiet in its rebellion against the ordinary. It was a field of wildflowers with no names on the stones, just words like, baked the best rye, or laughed at her own jokes, or watched stars every night. The world outside changed, fast. Cities grew, empires rose and fell, news cycles spun stories like hurricanes. But Hemsford stayed still, not because it had to, but because it chose to. The villagers believed the most extraordinary thing you could do was refuse to rush, to live not for applause or achievement, but for quiet tea, warm fire, and the simple joy of sharing space. And maybe that's why Hemsford, the place where nothing happened, has become something of a legend, because in a world that never stops shouting, the silence of Hemsford whispers something we've all forgotten. Stillness is not empty, it is full of life. So the next time the world feels too loud, remember Hemsford. Remember that not everything needs to matter loudly, some things matter deeply, quietly, unrushed. Because sometimes the best stories are the ones that don't try to be anything at all. And if this story helped you breathe just a little easier, leave a like, subscribe for more sleepy tales, and let us know in the comments. Would you live in a place where nothing happens? Because maybe, just maybe, that's the point. In Hemsford, life moved with the grace of a leaf drifting down a lazy stream. People didn't rush, they didn't multitask, they didn't set alarms or write to-do lists. They simply lived, and that in itself was enough. This was not because they lacked ambition or curiosity, but because they saw contentment not as something to chase but something to notice, already present in their day-to-day. Take Mrs. Peddle, for instance. She lived at the edge of the village in a small cottage with a crooked chimney and a garden full of lavender and leeks. She woke each day when the light touched her window and spent the mornings feeding her hens, who clucked like gossipy neighbors. Her breakfast was always the same, a slice of brown bread, a boiled egg, and a cup of nettled tea. Sometimes she hummed while she ate, not a song, just a note, a content sigh made sound. She didn't have much: a radio that mostly picked up static, a quilt with threadbare corners, a cat that never learned to come when called, but she had a rhythm to her days, a pulse. She'd mend her clothes with patches more colorful than the originals, making her dresses look like stories sewn together. She'd visit her neighbors not with a reason, but with a smile and a jar of jam. And in the evenings, she'd sit by the fire and knit for no one in particular. Baby socks, tea cozies, scarves long enough to trip over. It wasn't about the product, it was about the motion, the stillness it brought. And then there was old Jeb, who had the largest hands in the village and the softest voice. He whittled birds from bits of fallen wood and set them on his windowsill. Not to sell, not to give away, just to watch as the light changed the way they looked throughout the day. He believed every knot in the wood told him what it wanted to become. He never rushed it. Sometimes a bird took a week, sometimes a season. It didn't matter. When asked why he did it, he said, "I like the way quiet feels when I'm carving." Children in Hemsford grew up learning patience. They learned to watch seeds grow, to wait for bread to rise, to sit through stories that wandered more than they ended. They played games that had no winners, built forts that didn't need roofs, and told jokes that only made sense to them. They didn't measure time in hours, but in pies cooling on windowsills and clouds drifting across the sky. There was no competition. No one tried to outdo another. Success was measured not in gold or status, but in how well you listened to a friend, how kindly you spoke to a stranger, how tenderly you treated a tired dog. The butcher, Mr. Horace, only ever had one cut of meat per day. "Whatever the cow gives us," he'd say. Some days it was stew meat, other days a thick roast. People adjusted, they made do. Meals were created from what was available, not what was advertised. And because of that, food tasted more honest. Every bite was a reminder of simplicity. And when things went wrong, and they sometimes did, no one panicked. When the well ran dry one summer, the villagers walked to the brook. When the wind blew down a few shingles, they patched roofs together. Problems weren't dramatic. They were just things to be handled, preferably after tea. Once a boy asked his grandfather why no one ever moved away. The old man thought for a moment, then replied, "We could, but we'd just be taking ourselves somewhere else, and we quite like who we are here." The people of Hemsford didn't fear the quiet. They embraced it. In silence they found room to think, to feel, to just be. Without noise, they could hear the small things, the flutter of a sparrow's wing, the creak of a chair in the wind, the sound of their own breath as they sat beneath a tree. And maybe that's why they were so deeply content. Not because their lives were exciting, but because they weren't. Not because they had everything, but because they knew how to cherish the little they had. Contentment wasn't a goal, it was the way they lived. They didn't seek meaning, they wove it into every loaf of bread, every mended sock, every shared cup of tea. Sometimes, when the sky turned lavender just before dusk, the villagers would gather by the brook and say nothing at all. They'd just sit and listen and feel the stillness settle over them like a soft, warm blanket. And in those moments, without realizing it, they were teaching one another a lesson the world had long forgotten, that a simple life isn't empty, it's full of presence, full of breath, full of peace. So, if you ever find yourself wishing for more, maybe what you're really craving is less. Less noise, less rush, less demand, and more of what Hemsford had in abundance. Time, kindness, stillness, and the simple joy of being exactly where you are. Because in the end, maybe true contentment isn't about what happens to us, but how quietly and gratefully we receive it. What if the greatest luxury in life wasn't wealth, adventure, or applause, but simply stillness? Stillness. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. Not a pause in the world, but a quiet in the soul. In a time where the world hums and beeps and buzzes without mercy, where every second demands your attention and every click leads to another, there is something quietly magical about doing nothing, about being nowhere special, about simply being. Let me take you to a moment, not a place exactly, but a moment that lives in 1,000 places. The sun has just dipped below the hills, the fields are golden but fading, a kettle sighs from the hearth, and the room smells faintly of lavender and soot. Outside, the wind barely stirs the leaves. There's no car horn, no notification, no demand. Just a chair, a mug, a breath. That's stillness. Hemsford knew this stillness well. It wasn't something they chased, it was simply the way life was. The world beyond their hills might be chasing stock markets or chasing headlines, but in Hemsford, folks chased nothing. They tended their gardens, they fed their hens, they sat on porches and talked about the shape of clouds. You see, when nothing demands your attention, you begin to notice the little things, the sound of a distant crow, the way light changes color on a stone wall, the rhythm of your own breathing, and slowly, without trying, your thoughts slow down too. Your worries fold themselves up like laundry and settle into drawers where you don't have to look at them for a while. Mr. Fenley, the village tailor, once told a traveler, "Stillness isn't boring, it's where the interesting things hide." And he wasn't wrong. In the stillness of Hemsford, friendships deepened not through grand adventures but through quiet routines. The daily walk to the brook, the slow game of checkers played over a week, the way people remembered your favorite tea or how you took your bread. There were no calendar invites, no party hats, just porch visits and soft laughter. People in Hemsford didn't fear silence. They welcomed it like an old friend. Conversations didn't rush. Pauses weren't awkward. They were space, for gentle space, for thought, for breath, for understanding. Old Miss Pebble once sat for nearly 2 hours beside the blacksmith without either of them saying a word. When asked what they talked about, she smiled and said, "Everything." In stillness, time stops being an enemy. It stretches, softens. A minute feels like an hour, but not in a bad way, in a good way, like getting an extra slice of cake when you weren't expecting dessert, the kind of time that lets you really taste life. And yet, when the world outside hears about stillness, it scoffs. Wasteful, they say. Lazy. But oh, how much energy is spent chasing noise, chasing updates, chasing relevance, all while missing what matters. The villagers of Hemsford didn't miss much. They noticed when a robin built a new nest. They noticed when a cloud looked like a horse. They noticed when Mr. Tallow's bread was a little crispier than usual, because they were there, present, not split between a dozen thoughts, not juggling distractions, just there. Stillness, to them, wasn't something to fight against. It was a gift. A space where healing happened. A space where tired minds found rest. Where anxious hearts found a steady rhythm. On rainy days, the whole village seemed to move even slower. Footsteps softened, conversations curled like steam, people sat by windows and watched the world get wet. They didn't groan about delays or complain about wet socks, they just watched, because sometimes watching the rain was enough. Even the children knew how to be still, not because they were taught, but because they weren't taught to fear boredom. Little Elsie would lie under the willow tree for hours watching ants make their way across a root. Young Tom would sit beside the pond, dropping pebbles in and watching the ripples spread, not for any purpose, not to film it or share it, just because it felt right. In Hemsford, the value of something wasn't measured by how much noise it made, but by how much peace it brought. Now and then, a traveler would pass through the village, twitchy and hurried, their phones searching for a signal, their feet tapping with impatience. They'd ask, "Isn't it boring here?" And the villagers would smile and say, "Only if you're too loud to hear what life is whispering." Stillness, after all, has a voice, but it doesn't shout, it doesn't flash or beep. It speaks in heartbeats and kettle whistles, in rustling leaves and fire crackles, in the slow, steady hum of a world that isn't rushing to impress you. That's what made Hemsford special, not its history, not its sights, but its quiet confidence, its calm, its refusal to be anything other than itself. And maybe, just maybe, that's the secret we've forgotten. In the middle of our noisy lives, in the scroll, the shuffle, the stream, we've forgotten what stillness sounds like, what it feels like, and how badly we need it. So if your world feels too loud, if your thoughts race faster than your breath, if you haven't heard silence in days, find your Hemsford. It might be a real place, a bench in the park, a walk in the woods, or maybe it's just 10 minutes with the door closed, no screens, no plans, just you and a cup of something warm. Let the world be loud without you for a while. You'll be surprised what you hear in the quiet. And if this story helps slow your thoughts, even just a little, you've found the beauty of stillness. Let that feeling linger, let it settle. Let it remind you that you don't always have to chase the noise to feel alive. Because sometimes the truest life happens when nothing else does. Some of the greatest legacies in history don't come from battles or books or towering monuments, but from quiet lives, lived gently and well. In a world that worships fame, noise, and grand declarations, it's easy to forget that not all legacies are loud. Some are soft-spoken. They linger like the scent of lavender after rain. You may not read about them in history books, but they live on, in stories, in habits, in how someone stirs their tea or folds a quilt. Hemsford was full of those legacies. There was never a mayor in Hemsford. No statues stood in the square, no plaques, no parades, but there were stories, passed from fire to fire, porch to porch, like whispers carried on the wind. People remembered old Mr. Croft not because he was rich or wise, but because he always had peppermints in his pocket and gave them to anyone having a hard day. People remembered Mrs. Dalloway because she never let a sick neighbor go a day without soup, and they remembered little Peter Tish, who once gave away his only pair of boots when someone's feet were colder than his own. None of them made headlines, but their kindness stitched itself into the village like fine thread. You see, in Hemsford, legacy wasn't something you aimed for. It just happened, quietly, naturally, by living a life that made the world gentler for those around you. There was a tree near the edge of the village, the elder oak. No one knew who planted it, but every child was taught to respect it, not because it was sacred, but because it had shaded generations of storytellers, thinkers, and daydreamers. It was just a tree, but it stood because someone, long ago, had planted it without any promise of seeing it grow. That's what legacy looks like in a quiet place. Not loud, not urgent, just lasting. Mr. Bramble, the carpenter, had hands like bark and a laugh like gravel. He made most of the chairs in the village. Not one of them matched. Some leaned a little, some creaked, but every single one was made with care. He carved tiny symbols into them, stars, flowers, initials, so subtle you might never notice. But they were there, a touch of his soul etched in wood. Long after he passed, people still used those chairs, sat in them, rocked their children in them, and when one broke, no one replaced it, they repaired it, because it wasn't just a chair. It was Bramble's legacy, not loud, but felt. And then there was Mrs. Tinsley. She was the village's unofficial memory, not because she tried to be, but because she remembered every birthday, every recipe, every story. When someone died, she didn't write a eulogy. She baked their favorite pie. That was her way of honoring them: flour, butter, and care. One day, a boy visiting from the city asked, "Who's the most important person in this village?" Mrs. Tinsley answered, "You'll know when they're gone." That's how it worked in Hemsford. Legacy wasn't announced, it was discovered, slowly, like a flower that blooms while no one's looking. The village graveyard was a field of wildflowers, no marble, no grand headstones, just smooth stones with small phrases, laughed often, sang on Tuesdays, knitted well. It was enough. Because in Hemsford, your worth wasn't in your title or wealth, but in how you made others feel, in the quiet things. A cup of tea left at someone's doorstep. A song hummed while mending a friend's coat. The way someone always waited for the last straggler on a walk, no matter how slow. And that's legacy. Not fireworks, but firelight. Not thunder, but warmth. And yet somehow those quiet legacies traveled far. Travelers who passed through spoke of the way they felt after leaving Hemsford. Not amazed, not inspired, but calmed, healed, as if something they didn't even know was hurting had been gently mended. They couldn't name who did it. Was it the baker, the blacksmith, the lady with the crooked smile who offered them tea? Maybe it was all of them. Maybe it was just the way the village moved, together, slowly, kindly. That's how you leave a mark. Not with noise, but with presence. And maybe that's something we've forgotten in the modern world. We chase legacy like it's a prize, build brands, shout opinions, seek followers. But maybe the truest legacies are the ones we don't realize we're leaving. The neighbor you helped once who never forgot it. The child who remembers how you listened without rushing. The friend who still repeats the phrase you always said when things went wrong. Well, at least the sky hasn't fallen. In Hemsford, people didn't ask, "What will I be remembered for?" They asked, "Did I show up today? Did I make someone's burden lighter? Did I notice the little things?" And when they did, when they showed up again and again, rain or shine, with muddy boots and a loaf of bread, they created something far more lasting than fame. They created peace. A gentle peace that outlived them. So the next time you wonder what kind of legacy you'll leave, maybe don't think about statues or stories, maybe think about tea, about bread, about the soft way your hand steadies someone else's when they're unsure. Think about planting a tree you'll never sit under, baking a pie you won't get to taste, teaching someone to slow down, not because you told them to, but because you showed them how. Because legacies don't have to be loud. Sometimes the quiet ones echo longest.